In the name of Allah, the most merciful and the most gracious. As you know, we are doing chapter number 17, nervous coordination. So our today's topic is synapse. A synapse is a junction between an axon terminal of one neuron and the dendrite of another neuron, where information from one neuron is transmitted to another neuron is called a synapse. Or you can say it is a consecutive neuron which is arranged in such a way that the axon endings of the neuron are connected to the dendrites of the next neuron. So a synapse is basically the junction between two neurons where the information is traveled in the form of a chemical messenger. A synapse consists of three basic structures, which are the synaptic cleft, presynaptic neuron, and postsynaptic neuron. So if we talk about the synaptic cleft, it is the space between the two neurons where they meet together. And this space or gap is very small, which is measured in nanometers or less than that. This gap is called a synaptic cleft. You can see a synaptic cleft in the diagram. The presynaptic cleft or the presynaptic neuron is a neuron which carries an impulse towards a synapse. Postsynaptic neuron, it is the neuron which receives the impulse or information in the form of a chemical messenger after it crosses the synapse. Postsynaptic neuron is the neuron whose dendrites are in contact with the axon terminals of the presynaptic neuron. Now the mechanism of the synaptic transmission or the impulse transmission through a synapse. Synaptic transmission is basically the movement of impulse or a chemical messenger across the synapse. Impulses take place in the formation of a message which is transmitted across the synapse in the form of a chemical messenger, and that chemical messenger is called a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are the chemicals which are released from the synaptic vesicles, and they will pass across the cell membrane of the next neuron. Synaptic knobs and synaptic vesicles, these are the specialized structures. The typical one-way transmission from one axon to a dendrite or cell body is due to the fact that axons usually have several rounded synaptic knobs at their distal ends, which are not present at the dendrites. These knobs contain numerous membranous sacs called the synaptic vesicles, and when a nerve impulse reaches a knob, Some of the vesicles respond by releasing a neurotransmitter. Now here you can see the synaptic knobs, which are the button-like structures present at the end of the axon terminals of one neuron, that is the transmitting one. And in this diagram you can see the secretory vesicles or the synaptic vesicles, which when fused with the cell membrane will release the chemicals in the form of a neurotransmitter. So a synapse is formed between the neuron of the sensory receptors. They will be sent to the interneurons or the intermediate neurons, which are present within the nervous system, and finally the message will be passed to the effectors, which will perform certain action. Now we will see the steps which are involved into the synaptic transmission, or when the impulse is transmitted across the neurons. In this diagram you can see the diagrammatic representation of a synapse, in which the axon endings of one neuron have formed a synapse or a junction with the dendrites of the other neuron. The axon endings are of the transmitting neuron, whereas the dendrites are of the receiving neuron. First of all, an action potential arrives at the synaptic knob, which will open up the calcium channels in the presynaptic membrane. This causes the calcium ions to diffuse into the cells to channelize the membrane. The calcium ions rushes in. As the concentration of the calcium ions increases, synaptic vesicle moves towards the membrane. In the second step, the neurotransmitter vesicles fuse with the plasma membrane of the transmitting cell, just like this. Now in the third step, the fused vesicles release their neurotransmitter molecules into the synaptic cleft, which has been shown in green color in the diagram. Then in the fourth step, the released neurotransmitter molecules diffuse across the cleft and bind to the receptor molecules, which are present in different parts of your sensory areas, and these bind to receptor molecules on the postsynaptic cell surface membrane. Now in the step 5, the binding of the neurotransmitters to the postsynaptic neuron receptors opens some channels and allows sodium ions to diffuse across the postsynaptic membrane. As a result, postsynaptic membrane depolarize and an action potential is generated. The polarization brings the membrane potential towards the threshold level, which is the minimum stimulus required to initiate a nerve impulse. It is called EPSP, the excitatory postsynaptic potential. And finally, once the neurotransmitters have acted on the postsynaptic membrane, they are immediately broken down by the enzymes. And these enzymes are acetylcholine, which is hydrolyzed by acetylcholinesterase, and adrenaline by monoamine oxidase. Our next topic is the classification of the neurotransmitters. So first of all, neurotransmitters are the chemicals which are released at the axon endings, presynaptic knob of the neurons, at synapse involved in message transmission. Now, if we will look into the classes of neurotransmitters, they are classified as excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. Some of them can excite or brings about a change, and some of them will inhibit a change. The excitatory neurotransmitters are glutamate, aspartate, and nitric oxide. And the inhibitory neurotransmitters are glycine, GABA, serotonin, and dopamine. And the neurotransmitters which act as excitatory and inhibitory are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Neurotransmitters that cause increased membrane permeability to sodium and thus trigger nerve impulses, which include acetylcholine. It is an excitatory neurotransmitter of the peripheral nervous system. Serotonin and dopamine affect sleep, mood, attention, and learning. In the same way, epinephrine and norepinephrine, serotonin and dopamine, all of which also functions as hormones of your body. Some biogenic amines which are derived from the amino acids are important neurotransmitters in central nervous system. Now coming towards the inhibitory transmitters, neurotransmitters, which cause decreased membrane permeability to sodium ions. Thus causing the threshold of the stimulus to be raised. This action is called inhibitory because it lessens the chance that nerve impulse will be transferred to an adjoining neuron. Amino acids, gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA, and glycine. The endorphins are peptides that function as both neurotransmitters and hormones, which decreases our pain perception. This was all about today's topic. Thank you very much.